At 4 in the morning, 12 degrees below zero, Corinne Halloway was doing what she'd done every night for 14 months, looking for a wall that would break the wind. She was 27 years old, and everything she owned fit inside one canvas bag. The only thing in it that mattered was a gray-blue wool scarf her mother had knitted. The winter she went blind, one row pulled crooked, a letter C stitched slightly off-center. Behind the loading dock past Ballinger's diner, she saw a dark shape against the concrete and almost kept walking. Then she saw the shoe. Good leather, the kind nobody in Ironbridge owned. Then she saw the hand. The man was on his side, lips gone gray, breathing so shallow she had to crouch all the way down to hear it. And then she noticed the thing that stopped her cold. He was sweating. Nobody sweats at 12 below. Nobody. She turned his wrist over and found a thin steel bracelet tucked under his sleeve with 3 words stamped into it. And she'd seen one exactly like it before, years ago, on a 4th grader who'd gone down in the middle of choir practice. She remembered what the school nurse did that day. She remembered every step of it. Corinne had 4 sugar packets in her coat pocket, which was tomorrow's whole breakfast, and she tore every one of them open. Then she pulled the scarf off her own shoulders, the last thing her mother ever made her, the only warm thing she had left in this world, and she wrapped it around a stranger she'd never seen before. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask whether he could ever pay her back. She only knew that she had a scarf and he didn't. What she couldn't have known was who she'd just saved, or that somewhere across that city on the very same night, a phone had already rung about him, and the man who answered it had made a very different choice. If this story moves you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with us. Now let's go back to that loading dock behind Ballinger's diner and find out what happened when the stranger finally opened his eyes. She took both his hands and clasped them between her own, rubbing them back and forth, hard, then harder still. His skin was cold in a way she had touched only once before in her life and had never been able to forget. She kept rubbing, and she kept talking without pause, saying meaningless things she wouldn't remember a single word of afterward, her voice steady and low, as if she were soothing someone who could no longer hear her. Don't go to sleep. Can you hear me? Don't go to sleep here. His eyelids opened to a narrow slit, gray eyes, gray as the dirty snow piled along the curb, and they didn't see her, didn't see anything at all. They merely opened and closed again, like a door pushed by the wind, but he had opened his eyes. Corinne seized upon that one detail and held onto it as if it were a rope. On one of his fingers was a heavy ring with a black face, made of the kind of metal a woman like her would never hold in her hands, and her fingers passed over it without lingering for even half a second. There are nights when people don't have time to be curious. Then, through the wind, she heard something else, the hoarse rumble of an old pickup truck crawling down the street, a sound everyone in Ironbridge knew because it came at that exact hour every day. Corinne sprang to her feet in the middle of the road and raised both arms. The truck stopped a few paces from her. The door opened, and Walt Prosser climbed out. The old man who collected recyclables before dawn, the only person in the neighborhood who called her by her name, instead of calling her that girl. He didn't ask a single question. He went straight to the man lying on the ground, dropped to one knee on the concrete, bent down, and pressed his ear against the man's chest. He stayed that way longer than she expected. Then he looked up. Still there, he said. Corinne let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Call an ambulance, Walt said, reaching into his coat pocket. She shook her head. I've counted, she said. He stopped and stared at her. Counted what? How long it takes them to get here, Corinne said. I've counted twice already, on 2 different occasions, for 2 different people. Both times, it took longer than you think. Go ahead and call, but we can't wait. Walt looked at her for another moment, then down at the man on the ground, and then he withdrew his hand from his pocket. He didn't argue. In this neighborhood, people didn't argue at 4 o'clock in the morning. Together, they slipped their arms beneath the man's back and knees. He was heavier than Corinne had expected, and lighter than she had feared. The weight of a large, tall man, whose body had stopped resisting. The truck bed was filled with cardboard boxes and aluminum cans tied into bundles. Walt swept everything aside with one arm, clearing just enough space, and together they laid the man down. Corinne climbed in and sat beside him. Just drive, she said. Where? Walt asked. Anywhere with heat. The truck shuddered and began to move. Wind tore into the bed from every direction, and Corinne turned her back against it, bending over the man to shield him, one hand gripping the edge of the wool blanket that was threatening to slip from his shoulder. She held 2 fingers beneath his nose and began to count. 1, 2, 3. Each interval lasted longer than she wanted it to. 4, 5. She didn't move her hand, not even once, for the entire journey, because there was a very childish thought in her mind then, one she knew was irrational but still didn't dare challenge, that as long as she kept counting, he would keep breathing, and if she stopped counting, he would stop too. The street drifted past on either side. Dark windows and signs with letters faded pale by time. As they rounded a corner, she saw the murky yellow light spilling from a window at the Haven House shelter, the only light still awake in the neighborhood at that hour. Corinne knocked against the side of the truck. Walt understood. The pickup slowed, turned into the alley behind the building, and the engine went quiet. In the sudden silence, Corinne could clearly hear the man breathing beneath her hand, and she realized that the sound had changed. It was no longer the shallow, broken breathing she had heard an hour before. It was still weak, but it was steadier. She sat upright, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that she had reached him in time. The back door of Haven House was never fully locked, only wedged shut with a small piece of wood. And everyone in the neighborhood knew it, though no one ever said so aloud. Corinne pushed the door open with her shoulder, while Walt went ahead supporting the man's head, and together they carried him through the narrow hallway and turned into the laundry room, where an old wall-mounted heater stood, the same one Corinne had spent many nights standing in front of, just to warm and dry her hands. She pulled the spare mattress from where it stood behind the door and laid it on the floor close to the heater, and they lowered him onto it. Walt straightened, let out a long breath, then looked down at the man on the mattress for a little longer. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" he asked. Corinne said she did. Walt nodded, but that nod didn't mean he believed her. It was merely an old man's way of accepting that there was nothing more for him to do there. He left. Corinne turned the heater up to its highest setting, listened as it shuddered and began to crackle, then sat down on the floor beside the mattress. She hadn't even taken off her coat when the hallway light came on. Sylvia Grange entered the laundry room wearing a neat sweater as though she'd never gone to bed, her hair carefully arranged, a cup of tea in one hand. She looked at the mattress. She looked at the man lying on it. Then she looked at Corinne, and she smiled. "You brought a stranger into my building before dawn," she said. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, and it was that very softness that sent a colder shiver through Corinne than the wind outside had. "This man was going to die in the street," Corinne said. "Everyone out there is going to die in the street," Sylvia said. "That's why this building exists. But this is a shelter, not a hospital. Do you know what happens to me if this man stops breathing on my floor? My license, my funding, 30 people sleeping upstairs." She took a sip of her tea. Then she said the words Corinne would remember for a very long time afterward. "Are you saving this man? Or are you only trying to make it a little easier for yourself to sleep?" Corinne didn't answer. She had learned long ago that arguing with Sylvia was like arguing with a wall. The wall never moved. Only the person arguing became exhausted, and the next morning that person would still have to ask her for a bed. Sylvia set her cup of tea on top of the washing machine. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Once it is fully daylight, this man leaves. I don't care where he goes. If he is still lying on that mattress at noon, then you won't have a place in this building either. Do you understand, Miss Halloway?" Corinne said she understood. Sylvia nodded, satisfied, and walked out, turning off the hallway light behind her. In the darkness, the only thing left was the red glow cast by the heater's filament. Corinne remained where she was. She filled a plastic cup with warm water from the sink, tore a clean piece of cloth from the laundry basket, dipped it into the water, then gently pressed it to his lips. Slowly, a little at a time, repeating the process every few minutes. His lips were cracked and dry, and each time she touched the damp cloth to them, she saw his jaw move slightly, the smallest reflex, almost nothing at all, but it was there. She listened to water running through the pipes overhead. She heard someone turning over in bed upstairs. At one point, between one touch of water and the next, her mind drifted away for a while, and she saw herself sitting in another room, a room with a window facing east, and a piano standing against the wall, a piano so old that its ivory keys had turned yellow, and someone was calling to her from downstairs. a voice so familiar that it hurt her in the center of her chest. And she had taught herself how to cut that thought short. She cut it off. She dipped the cloth into the cup again. Outside, the wind changed direction, striking the small, high window in the laundry room and making it rattle in its frame. Corinne pulled the chair closer, then abandoned it, and sat flat on the floor with her back against the washing machine. She meant to close her eyes for only a moment. When the sky began to turn the pale gray that comes just before dawn, she was asleep, her head tilted to one side, one hand still loosely holding the corner of the wool blanket covering the stranger's chest. She woke not because of a sound, but because she could feel someone watching her. The pale light of early morning was filtering into the laundry room through the small high window, and the man on the mattress had turned his head toward her, his eyes open. She sat up too quickly, striking her hand against the side of the washing machine, and she knew at once that he had been awake for some time. Not just a moment. A long time. He had been lying there, awake, watching her sleep, and had chosen not to wake her. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was still hoarse. "Yes," he said. His voice was dry and raw, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. She reached for the plastic cup, filled it with more water, then slipped one hand beneath the back of his neck and lifted his head. He drank slowly, 2 sips, then stopped. A little water ran from the corner of his mouth, and she wiped it away with the cloth. He let her do it without appearing embarrassed or uncomfortable, with the acceptance of a man accustomed to his body, sometimes refusing to obey him, a man who had stopped fighting that fact long ago. "Where am I?" he asked. "Iron Bridge," she said. "South of the city. This is the laundry room of a shelter." His gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in each thing, the heater, the laundry basket, the window. "How long have I been lying here?" "Since before dawn," she said. "It's almost morning now. Do you remember anything?" He was silent for quite a while. "I remember walking," he said. "I remember it was very cold. I don't remember when I stopped." "You did stop," Corinne said. "You were lying on the ground. You were barely breathing." He didn't answer. His hand, the same hand she had rubbed back and forth between her palms several hours earlier, now rested on the wool covering his chest, and he began to roll the edge of the fabric between his thumb and forefinger, slowly and absently, the way someone toys with an object while his mind is still finding its way back from somewhere very far away. "It's thicker here," he said. "My mother sewed it when her eyesight was nearly gone," Corinne said. "She did as much as she could." He nodded and released the edge of the fabric. "Is she still alive?" he asked. "No," she said. He didn't say he was sorry. He merely nodded again, and somehow that nod comforted her more than all the words of condolence she had heard over the past several years. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, followed by the closing of a door upstairs. He looked toward the doorway, then back at her. "The person who spoke to you last night?" he said. "That voice. You heard her?" Corinne asked. "I couldn't make out the words," he said. "I only heard the voice. Her voice goes through walls." Corinne almost laughed, but managed to stop herself. "She's the manager here," she said. "She wants you out of this building before noon." He absorbed that without blinking. "Then I'll be out before noon," he said. "You can't even sit up yet." "I will be able to sit up," he said, and there was something so level and so certain in the way he said it that she didn't argue. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What's your name?" "Corinne Halloway," she said. He repeated the name soundlessly, moving only his lips, as if trying something to see how it fit in his hand. "And you?" she asked. And there, between those 2 sentences, came a pause. It was so brief that if she had been looking down to wring out the cloth, or reaching for the cup of water, or simply looking somewhere else, she would never have seen it, but she was looking directly into his face. "Eli Barlow," he said. Sylvia didn't wait until noon. She came down to the laundry room just as the sun rose above the roof of the building across the street, stood in the doorway with her arms folded over her chest, and said nothing at all. She simply stood there watching until Corinne understood. Walt Prosser returned with his pickup earlier than usual, and Corinne suspected Sylvia had sent someone to find him while it was still dark. No one said so aloud. The result was the same. The man managed to sit up, just as he'd said he would, but that was as far as he got. The 2 of them had to support him all the way out to the truck, and he stood with one hand braced against the side of the truck bed for a long time before he found enough strength to climb in. They took him to Ruth Ballinger's all-night diner on the corner, where a narrow storage room behind the kitchen was crowded with sacks of flour and a folding cot Ruth used on nights when she didn't feel like going home. Ruth opened the door, looked at the man, then lowered her eyes to his shoes, still caked with muddy snow, and lingered there longer than necessary, much longer, long enough for Corinne to realize that she was reading something in those shoes. Then she stopped. She unfolded the cot, lit the oil heater, and told Walt to move the sacks of flour aside to make more room. He remained there for 3 days. On the second day, his fever climbed dangerously high, and he drifted in and out of delirium, speaking in broken fragments with the voice of someone arguing with another person in a dream. Ruth went next door and called a retired nurse who lived at the end of the row. The woman came, placed a hand against his forehead, examined his eyes and fingernails, and told them to keep giving him water. If the fever hadn't broken by evening, they would have to take him to a hospital. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask why he was lying in the storage room of a diner. In Ironbridge, people didn't ask questions like that. It was an unwritten law everyone knew by heart. That night, Corinne sat beside the folding cot and did the same thing she'd done in the laundry room. She pressed water to his lips, waited, then pressed water to them again. Near dawn, his fever finally broke. The following morning, as she was preparing to leave, she picked up the folded wool blanket from the chair and opened it, spreading it over him once more, on top of Ruth's blanket, and she did it quickly, almost clumsily, as though slowing down for even a second might give her time to stop herself. He looked at her. "You need it too," he said. "I have a coat," Corinne said. "Your coat is thin." "I know exactly how thin my coat is," she said. "You don't need to tell me." He didn't respond to that, and she left the storage room before he could think of anything to say. That afternoon was Saturday, and every Saturday afternoon she went to Fairview. Ruth lent her a brown wool coat that hung behind the kitchen door, a coat that still carried the scent of fabric softener and Ruth's kitchen. A warm, unfamiliar smell that didn't belong to Corinne. She put it on and left. Nell was sitting by the window, her hands moving steadily as she knitted. A long fever when she was 12 had taken nearly all her sight, and now she knitted without looking down even once, her fingers traveling over the yarn the way someone moves through their own home during a power outage. "You're here," Nell said before Corinne had a chance to speak. The sisters sat together for nearly an hour. Corinne told her about the class, about a little boy who always began singing half a beat ahead of everyone else, about rehearsals for the spring performance, and about the stern vice principal who had finally begun to listen to her. There was no class. There was no little boy. She had been telling those stories for so long that they had acquired characters of their own, personalities of their own, even shared memories they could return to. Nell laughed, and her laughter sounded exactly as it had when the two sisters were still living at home. As Corinne was leaving, the woman at the front desk called her back. She spoke quietly and politely, never taking her eyes from the screen. "The account is 3 months overdue," she said, and then she read the amount. Corinne heard the number and felt nothing at all. Her mind went blank, because it was more money than she could come close to earning even if she washed dishes every night until the end of winter. "If it isn't paid by the end of this month," the woman said, "we'll have no choice but to transfer your sister to a lower-level facility." "Where?" Corinne asked. The woman named a town Corinne had never visited, so far away that a single visit would consume an entire day. Corinne thanked her. She walked outside, stood on the front steps for a moment, then buttoned the borrowed coat all the way to her throat and began walking home, because she no longer had enough money in her pocket for a single bus ride. On the morning of the 4th day, about a 30-minute drive from Ruth's diner toward the harbor, there was a room on the 2nd floor of the warehouse operations building. And inside that room, 7 men were all speaking loudly at once. They had been speaking that way for nearly 20 minutes. One man slammed his hand against the table. Another stood up and then sat down again, and at the head of the table was an empty chair no one dared occupy. Then the door opened. The man who entered didn't say a word. He took off his coat, draped it over the back of the chair, pulled the chair out, and sat down. In the space of 4 breaths, the room went from loud to completely silent, and no one had ordered anyone else to be quiet. The man who was standing sat down. The man holding a cup set it on the table. Elias Barone sat with his back straight and both hands resting on the table, and he looked slowly around the room, neither quickly nor slowly, pausing on each man just long enough for that man to know he'd been seen. Then his gaze came to rest on the man sitting at the far end of the table on the right, the manager of warehouse number 4, a large man in a sweatshirt who had spent the past 2 years putting his name on shipping manifests and signing those papers with a very steady hand. "Everyone out," Elias said. 6 men stood and left. The door closed. The warehouse manager remained in his chair, his shoulders already beginning to slump slightly forward, and he opened his mouth to speak. Elias didn't let him. He placed the first item on the table, a thin stack of papers containing copies of the registration records for a company in another state, a company no one had ever heard of, with a post office box for an address. He placed the second item on the table, a printed screenshot of an account showing dates and lines of repeated transfers, as steady and regular as a heartbeat. Then he placed the third item on the table, a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and pushed both across the table with his fingertips. "Write down how much you took," Elias said. His voice was no louder than the heater in the corner of the room. "If the number you write matches the number I have, then at 11 o'clock this morning, you leave this city, and I forget your name. If it doesn't match, I'll understand that even now, you still think I'm a fool." The warehouse manager stared at the blank sheet of paper. He didn't touch the pen for a long time. He tried to look up, tried to find something in Elias's face, an opening, some place where negotiation might be possible. And he found nothing at all, because there was nothing on Elias's face. No anger, no contempt, no pity, only patience. The man picked up the pen. He wrote. His hand shook, drawing the final stroke out into a long smear. Then he pushed the paper back across the table. Elias looked down at it once, no longer than it took to read a single line, then folded it in half again, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. 11 o'clock, he said. The warehouse manager stood. He walked out, and near the door he turned back once, but Elias was no longer looking at him, so he kept going. The door closed. The only sounds left in the room were the heater and the distant call of a ship's horn drifting in from the harbor. Elias sat motionless for a while longer, both hands still resting on the table. Then he reached into his pocket and took out a small wrapped piece of candy, the kind he always kept several of in every pocket of every suit he wore. He peeled away the wrapper. His fingers moved a little more slowly than usual, and they trembled, very slightly, just enough to make the glossy wrapper crackle in the silent room. He put the candy into his mouth. He closed his eyes, leaned his head back against the chair, and remained that way until all the sugar had dissolved. Corinne was standing at the sink behind the diner kitchen, both hands submerged in soapy water, when Toby came running in. He was Ruth's 11-year-old grandson, thin and quick, and he spent all day darting through the neighborhood like a shuttle. He held out a piece of paper folded into quarters. "From the man in the storage room," he said, then turned and ran off again before she could ask another question. Corinne dried her hands on her apron and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was strong and slanted to the right, written in dark ink, and there were only 2 lines with 2 initials beneath them. She read it twice. Ruth was stacking cups on a shelf, and she turned to look at Corinne, then at the paper in her hand. She opened her mouth. Corinne waited. Ruth closed her mouth again and returned to the stack of cups. "It's none of my business," she said. "Go on upstairs." The stairs behind the kitchen led to a narrow landing, and then to the storage room door, which had been left slightly open. Corinne knocked, then pushed it inward. He was no longer lying down. He was sitting on the wooden chair beside the window, wearing a clean shirt that wasn't his face shaved and his hair combed. And for the first moment, Corinne stopped short because she had the feeling she'd entered the wrong room. It was still the same face, still the thin scar crossing the outer edge of his left eyebrow. But the man sitting in that wooden chair carried more weight than the man who had lain on the mattress in the laundry room, weight that had nothing to do with how much he weighed. He rose when she entered. He greeted her with a nod, very brief and very precise, the kind of greeting given by someone who had been carefully taught his manners from a very young age. "Miss Halloway," he said. "You asked to see me," Corinne said. He gestured toward the second chair. She didn't sit. She remained standing in the middle of the room, her hands still damp, and looked at him. "There's something I have to tell you," he said. "Go ahead." "My name isn't Barlow." Outside the window, a car passed, and then the sound was gone. "It isn't," she said. Her voice sounded so normal that even she was surprised. "No," he said. "Eli is real. Barlow isn't." "Then what is it?" "Elias Barone." Corinne stood motionless. She knew that name, not in the way someone knows a name they've heard somewhere before, but in the way everyone who lived on the south side of the city knew it. The name buried at the bottom of stories people told late at night, and then abandoned halfway through. The name connected to the docks, the rows of warehouses, and the buildings that changed hands without anyone ever seeing the paperwork. He was still standing. He didn't sit down, and she understood that he was deliberately remaining on his feet, so she wouldn't have to look up at him. "There's more," he said. "3 buildings in this neighborhood belong to my family. So does a 4th. I came to Ironbridge to see all 4 of them for myself because I have a decision to make." "What decision?" "Whether to sign the clearance order. The building I needed to examine most closely was the one with the laundry room where I spent that night." Corinne could clearly hear the dishwasher running in, the kitchen below. She could hear herself swallow. "You lay on my mattress," she said. "I rubbed the last of my sugar into your mouth. And you were planning to sign a paper that would throw me out of the place where I sleep." "Yes," he said. "You aren't going to deny any of it?" "If I intended to deny it," he said, "I wouldn't have asked you to come here." Corinne turned toward the window because she didn't want him to see her hands. They had begun to tremble, and she clasped them tightly together in front of her stomach until the trembling became pain. Outside there was nothing but a stretch of brick wall and a section of drain pipe. "What were you planning to do with me?" she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He answered at once, and she understood that he'd prepared the answer before she'd even climbed the stairs. "I was planning to leave," he said. "I was going to let Ruth believe I'd recovered and taken a bus north. I was going to disappear from this neighborhood one morning before anyone had the chance to ask me any questions. Then, a few months later, when winter was completely over and no one remembered the man who'd lain in the storage room, an envelope would arrive for you. Cash. Enough to pay everything you owe and leave some over. Enough that if anyone asked where you got it, all you'd have to do was remain silent, and they'd stop asking." Corinne continued staring out the window. "And I'd never know who sent it," she said. "You'd never know. You planned that part too. I planned that part too." She turned around. "Then why don't you do exactly that?" Elias was silent for a moment. He sat down on the wooden chair, and this time he sat like a tired man, not like a man guarding his position. "Because I've lain in this room for 3 days, he said. "And for those 3 days, I haven't been able to think about anything except those packets of sugar. You don't understand," he continued. "You won't understand, because to you they were only packets of sugar. I grew up in a house where everything anyone gave you came with a price. My father taught me from the time I was a child never to accept anything unless I knew when the person giving it would demand repayment. Where I come from, a gift is a deposit. A favor is an undated debt. I've lived that way my entire life, and I believed everyone else did too. The only difference was that some people hid it better than others. Then I collapsed in a loading yard at 4 o'clock in the morning, and a woman who didn't know me poured her entire breakfast for the following day into my mouth, then sat beside me counting my breaths until dawn. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask how much I could pay." He stopped. "If I leave this place and send you an envelope," he said, "then I'll have turned that night into a payment, and I'll have to live with that." Corinne listened to everything. She listened very carefully, and when he finished, nothing inside her had softened in the slightest. Instead, something hardened and turned cold very quickly. "You tell that story beautifully," she said. He looked at her. "You could have told me that first morning," Corinne said, "when I gave you water, when I asked your name. You had an entire pause in which to tell me the truth, and you used that pause to invent another name." "Yes," he said. "You keep saying yes," she said, "as if saying yes makes everything all right." He didn't answer. Corinne walked to the door. She didn't slam it, and she didn't say anything else. She simply left, went down the stairs, crossed the kitchen, passed Ruth without looking at her, and stepped outside. She had walked half a block when she understood what was hurting her. It wasn't that he was rich. It wasn't that he owned 4 buildings and bore a name the entire neighborhood spoke in lowered voices. During the past 3 days, she hadn't doubted that man once, not for a single second. Over the past 14 months, she had learned that trusting someone was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she had thrown every one of those lessons out the window simply because a stranger on a mattress had needed her. That was why she was angry. She was angry because she had dared to trust him. The second note arrived the following day, once again delivered by Toby, once again folded into quarters, and this time it contained only a single line. He wrote that he'd rented the ground floor of number 12 Ironbridge Street, that he would remain in the neighborhood for a while, that he wasn't asking her to come, but that he would be there every afternoon. He signed it with a single initial. Corinne folded the note and slipped it into her coat pocket, and she didn't go. She didn't go the following day or the day after that. She washed dishes for Ruth, took in several coats to mend for 2 women who lived at the end of the row, slept at Haven House, and spoke to no one. By the end of the first week, she still hadn't gone. In the middle of the second week, on an afternoon when the sky had cleared a little, she walked along Ironbridge Street and didn't turn down the shortcut she usually took. The ground floor of number 12 looked nothing like anything she'd imagined during those 2 weeks. It was a long room with bare walls and no curtains. There was a wooden table, 2 chairs, and an electric heater on the floor. Several stacks of files stood in neat rows on the table beside a kettle. There was nothing else. This isn't anyone's home, she thought. This is a room being used for work. He opened the door before she had a chance to knock, and he was wearing an ordinary gray sweater with the sleeves rolled up. No ring, no watch. His hands were bare, and the paler band of skin where the ring had once rested was still visible. She understood at once that he'd removed those things before she arrived, and she didn't know whether she should feel comforted or troubled by it. The gray-blue wool blanket lay on the second chair, neatly folded into a perfect square and placed precisely in the center of the seat. Corinne looked at it. She stood there looking at it longer than she'd intended. Then she pulled out the other chair and sat down, and she didn't pick up the blanket. He poured tea. He didn't ask why she'd taken 2 weeks to come, and she was grateful to him for that. "I have a question for you," she said. "Go ahead. That night, you were walking alone. No one in this neighborhood walks alone at 4 o'clock in the morning, not even someone with nothing to lose. You had everything to lose. Why didn't you call anyone?" Elias set down his cup of tea. "I knew beforehand," he said. "Not at 4 o'clock in the morning. Much earlier than that. I noticed the signs while I was still near the harbor, and I knew exactly where it would lead if I didn't stop. I had a phone in my pocket. I had at least 4 numbers I could have called, and within 15 minutes, a car would have come to collect me anywhere in this city." "Then why didn't you?" "Because I would have had to say into the phone that I needed help," he said. "And the person who answered would have had to come, and that person would have seen me." He was silent for a moment. "In more than 20 years, no one who works for me has ever seen me in that condition. Not one person. I guarded that more carefully than anything else I've ever guarded. So I kept walking, and I thought I could make it to the end of the street. Then I thought I could make it to where there was light. Then I didn't think anything at all." He looked down at his bare hands. "I would have rather died in the snow than let my own people see me fall to my knees," he said. Then, very softly, almost without sound, he added, "That was the most foolish thing I've ever believed." Corinne didn't answer. Outside, water dripped from the eaves as the snow on the roof melted. "Let me ask you a question in return," he said. "Go ahead. You could have kept walking. It was dark. No one saw you, and no one would have known. You still had to walk home, and you still had to find somewhere to sleep. Why did you take it off and give it to me?" Corinne thought. She thought longer than he'd expected her to. Long enough for the water in the kettle to grow cold, because she wanted to give the right answer, not a beautiful one. "Because I had it," she said. "And you didn't." He said nothing more. When she stood to leave, the wool blanket remained on the other chair, and both of them saw it, and neither mentioned it. That evening, as Corinne hung her apron behind the kitchen, Ruth called after her in the tone of someone mentioning something unimportant. "Someone sent Toby a trumpet," she said. "It's old, but it was polished until it shone, and it came with 3 months of lessons paid in advance. Someone left it by the back door early this morning. No letter, no name." Rufus Vance came to number 12 Ironbridge Street one morning without warning, and he stood in the middle of the empty room, looking around once, before removing his gloves. He was 61 years old, short and solidly built, with silver hair combed straight back, and he'd remained at Elias's father's side for 30 years, since the days when the Barone name had meant nothing on the south side of the city. He was the man who had taught Elias how to tie a necktie. He was also the only person still alive who knew about the candies in Elias's pockets. He'd known since Elias was a child, and he'd kept that knowledge all those years without mentioning it once, the way someone guards a thing not out of kindness, but because he knows the day will come when it can be used. "How long have you been sitting in this room, boy?" Vance said. He still called him that, just as he had for 30 years, and he'd never raised his voice in his life. "Long enough. Elias said. Vance pulled out the second chair and sat down. He looked at the wool blanket folded into a neat square on the table, looked a little too long, then shifted his gaze away as though he'd noticed a stain on a tablecloth and decided not to mention it. People are beginning to ask questions, he said. No one has asked me anything. No, they don't ask you. They ask me. That's been my job since before you learned to walk. He tapped his fingertip lightly against the table 3 times, then stopped. You walked alone through this neighborhood. You slept in the storage room of a diner. You sat drinking tea with a woman who sleeps on the street. I'm not saying you're wrong, boy. I'm telling you that people are watching. And what they're watching isn't you. What they're watching is the name. Your father left you a name, Vance said. Not a chair. Anyone can sit in a chair. A name takes 3 generations to build. And now you're taking that name and using it as a blanket for a woman who collects scrap in Ironbridge. Elias didn't answer at once. He poured water into the kettle, plugged it in, and only then turned back. Is that all you came here to tell me? No, Vance said. I came because of the Ferretti family. They've given us their answer. Elias waited. They're in, Vance said. They'll provide all the capital we need for this neighborhood. Every bit of it. Without haggling over a single dollar. They're holding to only one condition. The same condition discussed while your father was still alive. They don't want this to exist only on paper. They want a family bond. Elias leaned against the edge of the table with his arms folded over his chest. I'm going to cancel it, he said. The only sound in the room was the kettle beginning to whistle. Vance remained seated. He didn't frown, didn't sigh, and didn't ask Elias to repeat himself so he could be certain. He simply sat there and looked at him for another moment, then nodded. All right, he said. Elias furrowed his brow. You have nothing else to say? You're the one sitting in that chair, Vance said. Not me. If you say cancel it, I'll draft the letter. I'll write it so the Ferretti family doesn't lose face. There'll be compensation and an explanation that sounds reasonable enough. I can handle that. Vance stood and began pulling on his gloves again, one finger at a time, slowly. You know, he said, your father sometimes wanted to do things like this too. He wanted to put things in order. He wanted to make them clean. He told me that several times, when he was younger than you are now. Then what happened? Then he grew old, Vance said. People often grow old before they have the chance to act. He walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped, turned his head, and smiled. A genuinely warm smile. The smile of an uncle who had watched his nephew grow into a man. You do what you believe is right, boy, he said. I'll take care of the rest. Then he stepped outside and closed the door very gently. Elias stood alone in the room, and he realized that the water had been boiling for some time, and he still hadn't unplugged the kettle. She came on Wednesday afternoon, then again the following Wednesday, and again the week after that. Neither of them called it an appointment. It simply became one. How many ledgers do you have? She asked the first time. More than I could read in a lifetime, he said. My father wrote everything by hand. He didn't trust machines. Some of these books are older than I am. The writing already faded, and I sit here tracing every line, trying to understand who still owes what to whom. And have you figured it out yet? No. I understand perhaps part of it. The rest, I guess. She looked at him. When people look at you, they don't think you're guessing. That's the difficult part, he said. I look like a man who knows exactly what he's doing. I was taught that appearance from childhood, taught it more carefully than I was ever taught to read or write. But most of the time, I'm sitting in front of a column of numbers and simply trying to make the least damaging guess. Everyone is guessing, she said. Yes, he said. Some people are simply better at hiding it. The second time, rain and snow were falling together, and she arrived late. He didn't ask why. He poured tea and waited. My mother was a seamstress, she said after they had been silent for a while. She mended clothes for the entire street. Whenever someone was getting married, they came to her. She kept working until her eyes could no longer see the stitching clearly. Then she slowed down, and after that, she worked by touch instead of sight. When did she die? A few winters ago, she said. I stopped teaching to stay home with her. They told me to take all the time I needed and come back when it was over. When I returned, my position no longer existed. He didn't say anything. I have a younger sister, she said. She's at Fairview. She hasn't been able to see since she was 12. She can knit without looking. My mother taught her during the same year. Her own eyesight failed. He still said nothing. Corinne continued. and she was surprised that she did. "My car was towed away one night in January," she said. "I'd been sleeping in it for nearly 6 months. I left a sweater and a box of photographs inside. When I went to ask for them back, they told me I had to pay the storage fee before I could retrieve my belongings, and I didn't have the money. So I stood outside the fence looking at my car, and then I walked home." "Did anyone help you?" he asked. "Ruth fed me. Walt gave me rides. Poor people help one another with whatever they have." Elias didn't say he would pay her debts. He didn't tell her to move into his home. He didn't say a single word about money. He merely sat there with both hands around his cup of tea, and he listened in a way she had never encountered before, as though he were gathering up each thing she said and putting it somewhere safe, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. The third time, he pushed a file across the table toward her. "What's this?" she asked. "A survey of the 4 buildings," he said. "My people prepared it. I've read it 3 times, and it seems too polished. You lived in that building. Tell me what's wrong in here." Corinne sat straighter. She opened the file and read slowly, turning each page, one finger tracing the lines. Then she stopped. "Here," she said, "the number of people using the services. This figure is less than half the number who actually sleep in that building every winter night. Are you certain?" "I sleep there," she said. "I know who lies where. The problem is that Sylvia counts only the people who have all the proper documents. Anyone without identification, anyone without a previous address, anyone who comes in for only a few nights to escape the cold and then leaves. She doesn't record them. If she counted everyone, the ratios in her funding applications would look worse. She needs a number that looks good more than she needs one that's accurate." Elias sat in silence for a long time. Then he pulled the file back, picked up his pen, and wrote exactly what she'd said directly in the margin of the page. Corinne watched his hand as he wrote. Something rose inside her chest, and it took her a moment to find the name for it. For nearly 2 years, no one had asked her opinion about anything that mattered. That Saturday, Corinne went to Fairview, and the woman at the front desk didn't press the button to unlock the door for her. She apologized. She said a new report had been added to the file, sent by the shelter where Corinne was registered as a resident, stating that she had no stable place to live and was showing signs of mental instability. Under procedure, her visitation rights had been temporarily suspended while the matter was reviewed. Corinne asked who had signed it. The woman wasn't permitted to say. Corinne stood in the lobby, still holding the paper bag containing several skeins of yarn she'd bought for Nell with the money she'd earned mending coats, and she looked through the glass door into the corridor beyond, and she understood that this wasn't a mistake. She didn't go to number 12. She didn't tell anyone, but Ironbridge was a small neighborhood, and Ruth spoke to everyone, and by the following afternoon, Elias knew. He didn't go to see Sylvia. He didn't call her. Over the course of 2 days, his people obtained every funding application Haven House had submitted during the previous 6 years and placed them beside the food inventory records, the betting logs, and the utility bills, then sent everything to the board of the organization that held the building's title, along with an 11-page reconciliation report. It contained no threats, only numbers placed side by side. By the afternoon of the second day, Sylvia Grange left Haven House carrying a cardboard box, and the following week, her license to practice social work was suspended. But when Elias's people traced the path of the report sent to Fairview, they found something else. The report had been sent shortly before noon. 9 minutes earlier, Sylvia's phone had received a call lasting less than 2 minutes from a number Elias didn't need to look up to know who it belonged to. He stared at that line on the page for a long time. Then he folded the paper and told no one. On Wednesday afternoon, Corinne came to number 12, and she stood in the middle of the room instead of sitting down. "Sylvia lost her job," she said. "I know." "Did you do it?" Elias set down his cup. "Do you want me to lie or tell you the truth?" "Tell me the truth." "Yes," he said. "I did it." Corinne was silent. "She falsified figures for 6 years," he said. "That's true. I didn't invent it. But if she hadn't gone after your sister, I wouldn't have gone looking for it. So the most honest answer is, yes, I did it. And I did it because of you." She could hear her own heartbeat. "And if she ever touches your sister's name again," Elias continued, "I'll do something much worse." He said it in exactly the same voice he used when asking whether she wanted more tea. Not louder, not slower, and that was precisely why it sent a chill down her spine. In that moment, for the first time since the night in the loading yard, Corinne looked at the man sitting before her and felt afraid. not the way people fear a violent man. She was afraid because she'd just realized that he could erase a person from the life they knew in 2 days, using nothing but paperwork, without raising his voice even once, and that when he did it, nothing inside him trembled. She realized something else as well, something far more troubling. Sylvia had deserved it, and Corinne had felt relieved when she'd heard the news. "Don't you see anything wrong with what you did?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "but not the part you're thinking of." "Then what are you apologizing for?" "I'm not apologizing," Elias said. "You have every right to be afraid of me because of this. I think you should be afraid, but I won't stand here and tell you I regret it. Because I don't, and I don't want to lie to you ever again for as long as I live." After the 2-minute call he told no one about, Elias began reading everything again from the beginning. He had the complete list of companies controlled by his family brought to number 12, including those that didn't carry the Barone name, and he sat with those records for 3 nights in a row. Among them was a debt collection company called Vantage Recovery, registered in another state, which bought delinquent hospital debts for a few cents on the dollar and then demanded payment in full. He knew the company existed. He'd never asked what it did. On the 3rd night, he opened the file of orders he'd personally approved during the first months after his father died. They had been brought to him in batches, each one a thick file, and the procedure at the time was always the same. Someone placed a summary sheet on top in front of him. He read the summary, signed the final page, and the entire batch took effect. He'd signed that way many times. He hadn't read every name inside. He turned to the batch, signed in January. He ran his finger down the list, and then he stopped. On a line in the middle of the page was the name Halloway, accompanied by a vehicle registration number, the address of an impound lot, and an order for compulsory repossession to offset a debt. On the final page of that file, in the lower right corner, was his signature. On Wednesday afternoon, Corinne arrived and knew at once that something was wrong. The room was the same, and the table was the same, but he didn't pour tea. A sheet of paper lay face down on the table. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I need you to hear everything before you say anything," he said. "All right. My family controls a company that buys medical debts. Hospitals sell the debts cheaply to be rid of them, and the company buys them and pursues collection. Your mother's debt was among them." Corinne didn't move. "The collection orders were processed in batches," he continued. "They gathered hundreds of files into one volume, prepared a summary sheet for the front, and brought it to me. I read the summary. I signed the final page. I didn't open the file and read every line inside because I believed that was someone else's job." He turned the paper over and pushed it toward her. "This is the page with your name," he said, "and this is the page with my signature." Corinne lowered her eyes. She read the line bearing her name. She read the date. She recognized that date because it was the day she'd come home from work and found her parking space empty. And she'd stood there for nearly an hour because she thought she'd mistaken where she'd parked. Then her gaze moved to the bottom of the page. The handwriting was strong and slanted to the right. It was the same handwriting as the 2 notes folded into quarters that Toby had delivered to her. She placed the paper on the table. She didn't throw it. She set it down very carefully, as though it were something fragile. Outside, someone called to another person at the end of the street, and then the sound was gone. "How long have you known?" she asked. 3 nights. "You could have kept this from me," she said. "I could have burned it," he said. "It would have taken only 1 match. No one else has another copy. I checked. You never would have known, and you would have continued coming here on Wednesday afternoons." "Then why?" "Because you rubbed the last of your sugar into my mouth," he said. "I no longer have the right to hide anything from you." Corinne sat motionless for a very long time. She thought about that night. Not the night in the loading yard, but the night in January, when she'd stood outside the fence of the impound lot and stared through the wire mesh at her car, the sweater still lying on the back seat and the box of photographs tucked beneath it. She remembered telling herself that she would think of a way tomorrow. She remembered walking home that night, and it had been nearly as cold as it was on the night she'd found him. And now she was sitting across from the man who had signed that order. The man she'd taken the wool blanket from her own shoulders to cover. The man whose every breath she'd counted because she was afraid he would die. "Do you remember me?" she asked. He didn't understand the question. "On that sheet of paper," she said, "when you signed it. Do you remember seeing the name Halloway?" "No," Elias said. "I don't remember. I didn't read it." Corinne nodded. "There, she said. That's the worst part. Then she stood, and she walked out, and he didn't try to stop her. She didn't come the following Wednesday afternoon, but on Thursday evening, Toby brought a piece of paper folded into quarters down to the diner kitchen, and on it there was only an address, a line describing the property's status, and a question. Elias had written that he'd found the address in that same list, that the property was under foreclosure and hadn't yet been liquidated, and that he needed to know whether she wanted to hear about it. Corinne read the address beneath the kitchen light. She read it once more. Then she removed her apron. She arrived at number 12 after darkness had fully settled, and he opened the door as though he'd been standing there waiting all evening. She didn't take off her coat. "Do you know what you just wrote on that piece of paper?" she said. "An address," he said. "A 2-story house, foreclosed on more than a year ago, not yet sold, being held for the development project." "I grew up in that house," Corinne said. Elias stood motionless. "Upstairs was where Nell and I slept," she said. "Downstairs was my mother's shop. She opened it when she was in her 20s, and she closed it during that final year, when her hands could no longer hold a pair of scissors." She stopped. "I've walked past it almost every day all this time," she said. "The way from the place where I sleep to Ruth's diner follows that exact sidewalk. I taught myself not to look in that direction. It took me a long time to learn. Now I can walk past without turning my head. I don't have to think about it anymore. It's simply become that way. Will you come with me?" she said. "Now?" "Now." They walked. Snow was falling lightly, a dry snow drifting down slowly, and Ironbridge Street was almost deserted at that hour. Corinne walked a little faster than usual, and Elias didn't ask any questions. Halfway there, she began to speak, using the calm voice of someone describing an insignificant habit. "I've never washed that blanket," she said. He turned to look at her. "It still smells like the shop," she said. "New fabric, tailor's chalk, sewing machine oil. When those 3 things mix together, they make a scent all their own, unlike anything else. I know one washing would take it away, so I don't wash it. During some summers, I stored it in a trunk. The rest of the time, I simply left it as it was." Elias said nothing. They continued walking. Then she slowed, then stopped completely, and he stopped with her. The house stood on the corner, 2 stories high. Its red brick darkened almost black along the foundation. The front door had been boarded over with a sheet of plywood, bearing a foreclosure notice printed in black letters and stained by rain. The streetlight above cast a murky yellow pool over the sidewalk. Snow had gathered in a ridge along the front steps, untouched by a single footprint. The ground floor window was a large one of an older style, its glass still intact, the room beyond completely dark. And in the lower right corner of that pane, attached from inside, there was a piece of paper whose color had almost entirely faded, its 4 corners curling upward. The ink washed down to a pale brown. Words had been written on it by hand. A woman's handwriting, slightly unsteady, each letter leaning at the same angle. "Sewing and alterations. Use side entrance." Corinne stood perfectly still. Elias remained half a step behind her and didn't move any closer. Snow settled on their shoulders, on their hair, and on the white ridge along the steps, and neither of them spoke. A car passed at the far end of the street, its headlights sweeping across the glass before disappearing. In the dark window, the 2 of them appeared as faint reflections, standing side by side, directly where the paper had been placed. Corinne raised one hand, then lowered it. She didn't touch the glass. She only stood there looking at her mother's handwriting, the words her mother had written on some distant afternoon when her eyes could still see clearly and her hands were still steady, then taped to the window so people in the neighborhood would know which way to enter. No one had taken it down. It had remained there through all those winters, through all those snowfalls, inside a house where no one lived anymore. And it was still there. Corinne stood looking until her shoulders were covered in white. Then she turned and began walking back the way they'd come, and Elias walked beside her, and neither of them spoke a single word for the entire journey home. The storm swept down over the city on Tuesday night the following week. Corinne arrived at number 12 at dusk to return the file in which she'd added several pages of notes, and she intended to leave immediately. But by the time she reached the door, the wind was driving snow sideways across the street in thick sheets, and no vehicles were running anymore. "Stay," Elias said. "Wait until the storm passes before you go." The lights went out shortly before 10 o'clock. They didn't flicker and then fade. They went out all at once, while the entire row of buildings across the street remained lit. Elias stood, went to the door, and looked across the street for a long time before closing it again. "The lights across the street are still on," she said. "Yes," he said. "So this building is the only one without power." "Yes." The electric heater went off with the lights. Within an hour, the cold from the concrete floor had begun creeping upward through the soles of their shoes. Elias found 2 candles in a drawer, lit them, and placed them on the table. Then he made a call, spoke briefly, and put down the phone. "They said a car can be here in 20 minutes, he said, "to take me back to the main house. Then go." "I'm not leaving," he said. "What are you going to do sitting in a building with no heat?" "Someone wants me out of this neighborhood today," he said. "If I leave, they get what they want." Corinne didn't argue. She pulled her chair closer to the table, and they sat there with the 2 candles between them, while the wind struck the window frame in waves. It was around midnight when she noticed. He was in the middle of saying something about his father's ledgers when he stopped, then continued. But the next sentence had nothing to do with the one before it. She looked at his hand. His fingers were tapping continuously against the tabletop, without any rhythm. "Give me your hand," she said. He didn't. She stood, walked around the table, and took hold of his wrist. His skin was damp. "Which pocket has the candy?" she asked. "Coat," he said, hanging outside. His voice had slowed, the end of each word stretching out. Corinne went straight to the coat rack. Her hands didn't tremble. She searched the left pocket and found nothing, then searched the right and pulled out 3 pieces. She unwrapped all 3 with 2 fingers, returned to the table, and placed them in his hand one at a time. "Chew," she said. He chewed. She went into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, found a small carton of orange juice, pushed the straw through the top, and set it in front of him. "Drink all of it," she said. Then she pulled her chair close beside his, sat down, placed 2 fingers against his wrist, and kept them there. She said nothing more. She didn't ask whether he was all right. She simply sat there and counted. And this time she counted without fear, because she knew what was happening, and knew how it would end if she did everything correctly. And she was doing everything correctly. About 15 minutes later, the sweat on his forehead had dried. He managed to sit upright. He raised one hand and rubbed it across his face, then looked at the empty orange juice carton on the table, and then at her. "You're the second person in my life to see me like this," he said. "Who was the first?" Corinne asked. Elias didn't answer. He didn't evade the question, and he didn't say he'd tell her another time. He merely sat in silence and watched the candle flame, and she understood that asking again wouldn't change anything, so she didn't ask again. The storm eased shortly before dawn, and she left when there was just enough light to see the sidewalk. At noon that day, power was restored to number 12. The utility workers said there had been a fault in the area's switching system, and they apologized for the inconvenience. Elias asked no further questions. He merely walked slowly around the room, looking at each thing: the table, the 2 chairs, the stacks of files still arranged exactly as he'd left them. And he stopped beside the chair against the wall. The seat was empty. The gray blue wool blanket was gone. The man appeared at the back door of Ruth's diner late one afternoon, and it took Corinne several seconds to recognize him. Grant Marrow had grown so thin that his coat hung from his shoulders as though it were draped over a clothes hanger. His hair had grown past his collar, and he held a yellow envelope in his left hand, gripping it with his whole hand rather than his fingers. He didn't come inside. He remained outside on the step, leaving a deliberate distance between them. Corinne said nothing. She stood there with her hands still wet and looked at him, and there was nothing in her mind then. No anger, no pain, only a strange emptiness. "I know you don't want to hear anything I have to say," Grant said. "I'm only asking for 5 minutes." Corinne didn't answer. He understood that he could continue. "They came to me first," he said. "I didn't go looking for them. I was in debt then, deeply in debt. You already know what I owed it for. They knew everything. They knew who I owed, how much I owed, and the date it was due. They sat down at a table with me and spoke very kindly. They said there was a way." "What way?" Corinne said. Those were the first words she'd spoken. "They said your mother's medical debt had passed into their hands," he said. "They offered to restructure it, combine everything into a new loan with a longer term and a lower interest rate." It sounded like salvation. But the new loan required collateral, and the only asset available was the house. "You signed it," Corinne said. "I signed it," Grant said. Then they said something else. They said that if I left this city and never returned, every debt of my own would be erased. Wiped clean. Nothing left. He lowered his eyes to the doorstep. I signed that paper, then got into a car and left in the middle of the night, he said. I didn't say a word to you. I left you behind with my name on the contract and your mother's house. Corinne still said nothing. I came back twice, Grant said. The first time was the following summer. Someone was already waiting for me at the bus station. They didn't do anything to me. They only talked. They reminded me that the debt they'd erased could be brought back to life at any moment. The second time was the same. This time, no one stopped me. I don't know why, but I think it's because something higher up has changed. He held out the envelope. This contains a copy of the original contract, he said. The one with the signing date, my signature, and the place where they put your name, even though I never said a word to you about it. I've kept it from the beginning. I don't know why I kept it. I only know I didn't dare throw it away. Corinne didn't reach for it. Grant placed the envelope on the doorstep at her feet. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I was a coward. I know I was a coward. I know that more clearly than you ever could. But I wasn't going to leave without giving you this. Then he turned and walked out through the alley. Corinne remained where she was until the sound of his footsteps had completely disappeared. Then she bent down and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it there. Word that Grant Marrow had returned to Ironbridge reached Elias's people before nightfall. That evening, in the ground floor room at number 12, a man stood before the table and reported very briefly where Grant was, what means of transportation he was using, and that within a single hour, he could be made to disappear from the neighborhood and never return. The man finished speaking and waited. Elias sat in silence. No, he said. The other man thought he'd misheard. He didn't touch her, Elias said. He gave her a document and left. Yes, but what he did before. I know what he did, Elias said. If I give that order, then there'll be one more thing in her mind. She'll know that someone disappeared from this city because of her. She'll have to carry that for the rest of her life. He looked up. That woman saved me on a sidewalk, he said. I won't place that weight on her shoulders. Let him go. The black car was parked at the end of the block on the first afternoon, and Corinne didn't notice it. On the second afternoon, it was parked half a block away across the street, and she passed it on her way to the diner. By the third afternoon, she recognized it, and she recognized it in the way someone who had lived on the streets long enough knew what belonged to a neighborhood and what didn't. She changed her route. The car was still there the following day. On the fifth afternoon, just as she walked through the gates of Fairview, the car was parked directly in front of the steps, and the rear door opened. The man sitting inside didn't get out. He leaned forward slightly so she could see his face clearly, his silver hair combed straight back, his expression kindly, and he spoke in a very soft voice. Miss Halloway, he said, you may refuse. I won't follow you, and I won't send anyone else after you. But I think you should listen to me for a few minutes about your sister. Corinne stood motionless on the sidewalk. Then she walked forward and climbed into the car of her own accord, pulling the door shut behind her. The interior was warm. On the seat between them lay a square of gray-blue fabric, neatly folded, smooth and carefully arranged like an item displayed behind glass. Corinne looked at it. She didn't reach for it. I'm Rufus Vance, the man said. I've worked for the Barone family since before that boy learned to walk. I haven't come here to threaten you. I've come to discuss business, and business should always be explained clearly. Go ahead, she said. He drew an envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the seat beside the wool blanket. $300,000, he said. Your sister will be transferred to a facility far better than Fairview. She'll have her own doctor and someone to care for her for the rest of her life. You won't have to worry about another month for as long as she lives. I'll handle the paperwork. I'll also arrange the visits, once every week, with a car to take you there and bring you back. In exchange for what? Corinne asked. You leave this city, Vance said, quietly, without explaining yourself to anyone. You go, and you don't return. Corinne looked at the envelope. You know I have nothing, she said. I know, he replied. That's precisely why I believe you'll agree. She didn't answer. Vance leaned back against the seat, and his voice softened until it was almost compassionate. Miss Halloway, I don't look down on you, he said. I look down on the idea that if people live decent lives, life will eventually give them something in return. Your mother lived decently her entire life. She died in debt with a broken sewing machine and a house she'd lost. She left her 2 daughters exactly 1 cheap piece of wool. That's everything she received in return. Do you intend to continue down the same road? The car was silent. Corinne could hear the engine idling. She could hear her own heart. She didn't shout. She didn't move. She merely turned and looked directly at him. And when she spoke, her voice was even lower than his. You're right about one thing, she said. My mother died with nothing, but she died without anyone ever having to sit in a car and buy her silence. No one had to spend a single dollar to keep her from speaking. But you're sitting here with all that money, trying to buy mine. You're richer than my mother was, but you're not her equal. Vance's expression didn't change. He only looked at her for another moment, then lowered his gaze to the wool blanket on the seat and pushed it toward her with 2 fingertips. Take this home, at least, he said. It belongs to you. Corinne looked at it. She looked for quite a while, and the man on the other side of the seat waited because he was certain she would take it. Then she opened the car door. Keep it, she said. Try putting a price on it. You put a price on everything else. She stepped down onto the sidewalk, closed the car door, and walked toward Ironbridge empty-handed, her collar raised against the wind, without looking back even once. On Saturday, Corinne arrived at Fairview earlier than usual. She carried a bag of yarn and a small box of cookies she'd bought with the money earned from mending coats, and she'd rehearsed several new stories in her mind about the classroom that didn't exist. The woman at the front desk looked at the screen, then up at Corinne, then back at the screen. She called someone. She spoke quietly into the receiver. Then she put down the phone and said the file had been changed during the week, that at the request of the new financial sponsor, all visits would be temporarily suspended until the verification process was complete, and that she was very sorry. What financial sponsor? Corinne asked. The woman wasn't permitted to say. For how long? Corinne asked. The woman didn't know. Corinne stood at the desk, and she didn't shout or strike the counter. She merely repeated each question one at a time, slowly and clearly, and every answer was another door closing. Then she picked up the bag of yarn and turned away. The corridor leading to the entrance had a row of large glass doors overlooking the common room, and Corinne passed them every time she visited, always walking quickly because she was on her way inside. This time, she wasn't going inside. She stopped at the glass. Nell was sitting in the chair beside the window, in the same place where she always sat, her hands moving steadily as she knitted. Someone had just walked past her. Corinne saw her lift her head and turn toward the sound of the footsteps. She saw her lips move. Nell called her sister's name. No one answered. She sat still for a moment, listening. Then she called again. Corinne stood on the other side of the glass, barely 10 paces away, and raised one hand to press it against the pane. She didn't call back because she knew that even if she did, Nell wouldn't hear her. Nell waited a little longer. Then she lowered her head and continued knitting. Corinne left Fairview and walked the entire way back, and she couldn't remember which streets she'd taken. It was dark by the time she reached number 12. She pushed the door open without knocking. Elias rose when he saw her. He looked at her face and didn't ask a single question. They wouldn't let me in, she said. He said nothing. There's a new financial sponsor in my sister's file, she said. No one will tell me who it is. But you know, don't you? I'll handle it, Elias said. You'll handle it, Corinne said. She repeated those 3 words, and she heard her own voice break in the middle. You'll handle it, just as you handled Sylvia. Just as you handle everything. Every time you finish handling one thing, something else comes crashing down on me, and each time, what falls is heavier than it was before. She set the bag of yarn on the table. Before you collapsed in that loading yard, she said. My life was bad. I've never hidden that from anyone. But it was my life. I was hungry. I was cold. I slept wherever people allowed me to sleep, and once a week, I got to sit beside my sister and lie to her about a classroom that didn't exist, and she laughed, and that laughter kept me alive for another week. She looked up. I'm still hungry now, she said. I'm still cold, and I can't see my sister anymore. Elias didn't move. You said you didn't want there to be any debt between us, Corinne said. Then this is what you owe me. Only this. Take your name, and leave this neighborhood. The only sound in the room was the electric heater. He stood there for a long time, and she didn't take back a single word. Then Elias Barone, The man no one on the entire south side of the city dared tell where to go, bent down, lifted his coat from the back of the chair, draped it over his arm, and walked to the door. He didn't look back. The door closed very softly behind him, and Corinne stood alone in the empty room with the bag of yarn on the table. 3 days later, someone called the landline at Ruth's diner and asked for Corinne Halloway. It was a nursing aide who had worked at Fairview since Nell first arrived. The woman who always called Nell, the girl who knitted. She said she was working the night shift on Thursday, that no one watched the side door of Wing B after 9 o'clock, that she would leave it unlatched, and that this was all she intended to say. On Thursday night, Corinne entered through the side door of Wing B. The corridor was dark, lit only by the nightlights along the baseboards. She passed 3 doors, stopped at the 4th, and gently pushed it open. Nell was sitting on the bed with the reading lamp on, her hands moving steadily as she knitted. "Is that you?" she said. Corinne stopped in the doorway. "How did you know?" "I heard your footsteps from the end of the hallway," Nell said. "You lean a little to one side when you walk. You've walked that way for a long time." Corinne sat on the edge of the bed. She was about to begin talking about the classroom, the spring performance, and the little boy who always sang half a beat too early. "Don't tell me any more stories about the school," Nell said. Corinne fell silent. Nell didn't stop knitting. "I've known for a long time," she said. "Since the summer before last. The summer when you said the school was renovating the music room." Corinne couldn't speak. "Your coat," Nell said. "Every time you came, it smelled different. Sometimes it smelled like a kitchen, sometimes like unfamiliar soap, and sometimes like oil smoke. People only have one winter coat, Corinne. If the coat smells different every week, then it means the coat doesn't belong to them." She dropped 2 stitches, then picked them up again. "And your stomach growled," Nell said. "You sat beside me for an entire hour, talking and laughing without stopping, but your stomach growled. Every single time." Corinne raised a hand and covered her mouth. "I didn't ask because I knew you'd keep lying," Nell said. "And when you lie, your voice sounds so miserable. I didn't want to make you do that even one more time." Then she laid the knitting needles across her lap, turned to her right, felt for the knob of the bedside table drawer, and pulled it open. She took out a tin box, the kind that had once held cookies, with one corner of the lid dented. She placed it in Corinne's hands. "Open it," she said. There was money inside. All small bills, 1s and 5s with several 10s, folded flat and arranged in little stacks tied with strands of yarn. "I sell handkerchiefs," Nell said. "The gift shop in the lobby accepts things made by the patients, and they keep half. I knit 1 every day, and 2 on days when I feel well. I've known how since Mother taught me. She taught me the same year her eyesight began to fail. She said I had to learn to knit with my hands instead of my eyes, because one day your eyes might be gone, but your hands wouldn't be." Corinne looked at the tin box in her hands, and then she couldn't see anything at all. "I was going to give it to you on your birthday," Nell said. "I was going to say I'd won some kind of prize, from the lottery at the Christmas charity fair. I've practiced saying it for a long time. I practiced making my voice sound truthful so you'd believe me, so you'd take it without feeling uncomfortable. I've repeated it so many times. Every night, I say it once in my mind." Corinne slipped down from the edge of the bed. She knelt on the floor beside her sister's bed, clutching the tin box to her chest with both arms, and she wept without a sound, her shoulders shaking in waves, her bowed head resting against the edge of the blanket. Nell reached out, found her sister's shoulder, then found her hair, and rested her hand there, leaving it in place. "Take it," she said. "If you owe money, then pay it. I'll still be here. Stop worrying about me for a while. Just for 1 week, take care of yourself." Corinne left Fairview shortly before 10 o'clock that night. She couldn't walk any farther. She sat down on the stone steps outside the gate, with the tin box resting on her lap, and she remained there in the cold, staring across the empty grounds, at the traces of snow still lingering beneath the trees. After a while, she heard an engine. Ruth Ballinger's old car turned into the drive, its headlights sweeping across Corinne's face before it stopped. Ruth opened the car door but didn't step all the way out. She was carrying a paper cup of coffee, still steaming, and she held it toward Corinne. She didn't ask if Corinne was all right. She didn't ask whether she'd managed to get inside, and she didn't ask what was in the tin box. She only said, "Get in the car. You're sleeping at my house tonight." Corinne took the cup of coffee. She held it between both hands for a long time before she stood. Then she climbed into the car, and Ruth turned around and drove out through the gates and neither of them said a single word for the entire journey home. Warehouse number 2 at the harbor had a long table standing in the middle of the concrete floor, and Elias arrived half an hour before the appointed time, so he could sit there alone. During that half hour, he thought about a distant afternoon when he was 9 years old. What he remembered most clearly wasn't what had happened to him. What he remembered most clearly was the sound of the dining room door closing. His father had closed the door first, before calling anyone, before telling anyone in the household to bring him something. He'd walked to the door and closed it, turned the lock, and only then returned and picked up the telephone. The doctor arrived within 15 minutes. Everything turned out fine, and the boy returned to school as usual the following day. But the sound of that lock remained. That evening, his father sat on the edge of his bed and told him that no one must ever know about this, not one person, not even those in their own household, not even after he was grown, because people weren't afraid of a strong man. They were afraid only of a man whose weakness they couldn't see. Elias had believed that for more than 20 years. The first person in his life to see him in that condition had chosen to walk out and lock the door. The second had chosen to remove the warmest thing she had and wrap it around him. The warehouse door opened. Rufus Vance entered, removed his gloves, and sat at the opposite end of the table. "You called me all the way out here," he said. "Yes," Elias said. Vance placed a photograph on the table and pushed it forward. It slid across the wood and stopped in the middle. The picture had been taken through the glass of a common room. A young woman sat beside a window, knitting with both hands. "The girl at Fairview," Vance said. "Her file is now under a financial sponsor. It doesn't matter which one. All you have to do is give me the word, and everything will be restored to the way it was before the afternoon is over." Elias looked at the photograph. He didn't touch it. Then he drew 2 sheets of paper from inside his coat and placed them on the table beside the picture. "The first is a printout of the device location data," he said, "from the night I collapsed on Ironbridge Street. The final location, with coordinates and time. The system transmitted it automatically at 2:38 in the morning." Vance sat motionless. "The second is the call log," Elias said. "At 2:41, the duty officer called your phone. The call lasted 52 seconds. You were the only person who received it. After that, no calls were made from your phone until 6:12 in the morning. The only sound in the warehouse was water lapping against the pilings. The duty officer stated that you said exactly one thing to him," Elias said. "You told him, 'I'll handle it.' Then you sat in your office until dawn." Vance still said nothing. "You didn't send anyone into the streets to find me," Elias continued. "You waited. Because if I'd remained out there until morning, it would have been an accident. No one investigates a man who freezes to death. There would be no killer to pursue. And this chair, along with all of Ironbridge, would have passed into your hands within a week, cleanly, without anyone asking a single question. You didn't send anyone to search until 6:12, just when there was enough daylight to make the search look genuine. But by then, I was no longer there." He looked directly at the old man seated at the other end of the table. "Because a woman lifted me into the bed of a pickup truck filled with recyclables and carried me away before dawn," Elias said. "You waited 8 months for a night like that, and you lost because of a wool blanket." Rufus Vance didn't wait for Elias to act first. The following morning, he convened the council, and he had the authority to do so because the bylaws written by Elias's own father allowed the longest-serving advisor to summon it whenever he believed there was a problem with the leadership. The meeting room was on the 3rd floor of the old building on the south side, with 11 chairs around a long table, and every chair was occupied. Vance spoke first. He didn't raise his voice. He'd never raised his voice in his life. He said he'd served this family for 30 years, that he loved the man sitting at the head of the table like a son, and that this was precisely why he had to reveal something he would have preferred to carry to his grave. Then he revealed it. He said that Elias Barone had lived with an illness since he was 9 years old, that on a night the previous January, he'd collapsed on a sidewalk in Ironbridge and lain there until someone found him, that Vance had concealed the truth all these years out of loyalty. But now, with the greatest project in the history of the family resting beneath the pen of a man who could collapse at any moment, silence was no longer loyalty. It was complicity. The meeting room fell silent. Several men turned to look at one another. Elias remained seated until Vance had finished. Then he stood. "He's telling the truth," he said. No one moved. "I've had this condition since I was 9 years old," Elias said. "I have to eat at the proper times, and I have to carry medication with me, and there is always candy in my pockets. That night, I walked alone through Ironbridge. I knew I was becoming unwell. I had a phone in my pocket, and I didn't call a single one of you. I didn't call because I was taught that the man sitting in this chair must never allow anyone to see him in that condition. I believed that for more than 20 years, and it nearly killed me. He looked around the table, pausing on each man in the same way he always did. As of today, you know, he said, all 10 men in this room know. I'm not hiding it anymore, which means it can no longer be used to threaten me. Then he turned toward Vance. You kept this secret for 30 years, not because you cared for me, he said. You kept it the way a man keeps a document in a safe, waiting for the day he can spend it. Today, you spent it. You intended to use it to frighten me, so now it no longer belongs to you. He placed 2 sheets of paper on the table and pushed them toward the center. And this belongs to me, he said, the location record from that night, the time the signal was received, and the call log. At 2:41 in the morning, the duty officer called Mr. Vance to report my last known location. He answered. He said he would handle it. Then, from that moment until after 6 o'clock in the morning, not one call was made from his phone. No one was sent. No one was notified. The man sitting beside Vance moved his chair a few inches away, very quietly, so subtly that almost no one should have noticed. But everyone did. You may vote on my position, Elias said. That is your right, and I won't stand in your way. But before you vote, you should consider one thing. If you decide today that it is acceptable for a man to sit in silence for 4 hours, while knowing the head of this family is lying in the street, then you are deciding for yourselves what will happen on the night each of you needs someone to answer your call. No one spoke. There was no vote. Rufus Vance remained seated for a while longer. Then he stood and pulled on his gloves, one finger at a time, slowly, just as he always did, and walked to the door. Not one person in the room rose. That afternoon, someone brought Elias a paper bag taken from Rufus Vance's car, and inside it was the gray-blue wool blanket, still folded into the same neat square as the last time he'd seen it on the chair against the wall. He didn't know how many days it had lain in Vance's trunk. It had absorbed the smell of leather upholstery and cigarettes, and there was a dark stain in one corner that he couldn't identify. He didn't want to return it to her in that condition. He had someone take it to a laundry shop on the next street, instructing them to wash it by hand, to be careful, and not to tear any part of it. The man had been gone for about 10 minutes when Elias, standing beside the window, remembered. He remembered the evening they'd walked through the snow, and the calm voice in which she'd told him that she'd never washed it, that it still carried the smell of her mother's sewing shop, the smell of new fabric, tailor's chalk, and sewing machine oil, and that she knew a single washing would take it all away. He stood motionless at the window for a long time. He'd recovered the only thing she had left from the hands of a man who wanted him dead, and within 10 minutes, he'd personally destroyed the most important part of it. He didn't call the shop. He knew it was already too late. He sat down, and he remained there until nearly nightfall. The telephone rang at 7 o'clock. The woman from the laundry shop spoke with the uneasy voice of someone afraid she'd damaged a customer's belongings. She said that while feeling along the folded border at one end of the blanket, she'd discovered something hard and flat inside, sewn shut within the lining with hand stitching that was unusually strong and dense, and she hadn't dared open it without permission. Elias reached the shop within 15 minutes. The woman spread the blanket across the table and handed him a small pair of scissors, and he stood there, cutting through the stitches one at a time, slowly, without severing a single strand of wool. The lining opened. Inside was a thin plastic bag folded in half, and the bag contained 2 things. The first was a large sheet of paper folded into quarters, made of heavy stock and bearing an embossed seal and a file number, the deed to the 2-story house on Ironbridge Street, in the name of Ada Halloway. The second was a small scrap torn from a notebook, written in pencil in large, clumsy letters that overlapped in several places, the handwriting of someone who could no longer see clearly where she was writing. Corinne. I hid this here because it's the only thing I'm certain you'll keep. Don't give all of it away. You must leave a little for yourself. Elias carried the blanket and both papers to Ruth's diner the following morning. Corinne was wiping down a table in the front room. She looked up, straightened, and said nothing. He placed the blanket on the table in front of her, neatly folded and clean, then laid the 2 papers on top of it. I had it washed, he said. I forgot what you told me that night on the street. By the time I remembered, it was too late. Corinne looked at the blanket. She reached out and touched it, then lifted it close to her face and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and turned her attention to the two papers. They were inside the lining at one end of the blanket, Elias said, sewn shut. The stitching there was several times thicker than anywhere else. Corinne unfolded the first document. Then she opened the second piece of paper. She read it, then read it again, and her hands began trembling so badly that the paper rustled. She sat down. She placed the note on the table and smoothed it carefully with her palm, again and again, as though pressing it firmly enough might darken the faded pencil marks. Ruth came out of the kitchen, saw what was happening, then quietly backed away again. A long while later, Corinne lifted the blanket and draped it around her shoulders. She ran one finger along the row of uneven stitches down one side. "You didn't fix them," she said. "It wasn't my blanket to repair," he said. The two of them remained seated in the front room of the diner, after Ruth had drawn the curtains. "There's one more thing I have to tell you," Elias said. Corinne waited. "The debt at Fairview was paid several weeks ago," he said. "The entire overdue balance, plus 6 months in advance. I did it immediately after the day you told me about your sister. I instructed them to say that an anonymous foundation had agreed to sponsor her if you asked." She looked at him. "What else?" "There's an apartment on the next street," he said. 2 rooms, with heat and insurance. The lease is in your name, and a full year has been paid in advance. I've had the key all this time, and I haven't given it to you." "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because if you knew, it would become a debt," he said. Corinne was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I'll accept what you did for Nell. I don't have the right to refuse on my sister's behalf. It isn't mine to refuse, but the apartment." She shook her head. "My father made my choices for me until the day he died," she said. "Then my mother became ill, and the hospital made them for me. Then Grant made them for me, and I didn't even know he was making them. And for the past 14 months, the cold has made them for me. Once every night, where I would sleep, which way I would walk, whether I would eat or go hungry. You're the first person in my life who has ever asked me what I wanted." She looked up. "Please don't become the next person who makes my choices for me," she said. "This time, I'm following my mother's advice." Elias didn't argue. He gave a single nod, and he never mentioned the apartment again. On Monday morning, Corinne went alone to a law office downtown, carrying the 2 documents inside the yellow envelope. Gideon Marsh received her in a room lined with bookshelves. He read the deed first, then the contract bearing Grant Marrow's signature. Then he placed the 2 documents beside each other and sat in silence for quite a while. "This one supports the other," he said. The property was pledged as collateral in a transaction when the owner was already deceased, and the person listed as the co-signer knew nothing about it. "I can handle this. It will take time, but it can be done." Corinne placed the tin box filled with small bills on the table. "I'm not asking him to do this for me," she said. "I'm hiring you. Charge me what you would charge anyone else, and I'll pay you with my own money, no matter how long it takes." Gideon Marsh looked at the tin box, then at her, and he didn't smile. He took out his ledger and began to write. That same week, Elias canceled the clearance order for Haven House. He didn't stop there. He transferred full ownership of the building to an independent nonprofit organization, with a binding clause in the deed, requiring that its governing board always include at least 3 members who had once been homeless. The building didn't bear the Barone name. There was no plaque anywhere. Gideon Marsh asked what he was receiving in return. "The knowledge that I don't have to be my father," Elias said. On Wednesday afternoon, Elias sat in the front room of Ruth's diner, and Corinne sat across from him. "I want to make one thing clear," he said. "I'm not a good man. Don't ever think I am. There are people in this city who lost everything because of a 30-second telephone call, and I stood in the room while that call was made. I've signed papers I don't dare read again. I'm trying to move in a different direction, but I'm not starting at the beginning. I'm starting in the middle of a pile of mud. I can't give you a clean version of myself because one doesn't exist." Corinne looked at him. "I haven't decided anything," she said. "I know. It may take a very long time. A year, perhaps longer. How long can you wait?" "I waited 3 days in that storage room just to hear your footsteps on the stairs," he said. "I think I can wait longer than that. Spring came late that year, but it came. The lawsuit took nearly 7 months, and when Gideon Marsh called with the news, Corinne was washing dishes in the back of Ruth's diner. She listened to the entire call without managing to say anything except, "Thank you." She paid his legal fees with her own wages, one installment at a time, every month, until the balance was gone. The two-story house on the corner of Ironbridge Street reopened one morning in April. The plywood was removed from the front door, and the rain-stained foreclosure notice was peeled away, but the piece of paper taped inside the ground-floor window remained exactly where it had always been, its four corners curled, and its ink faded to pale brown, and Corinne wouldn't allow anyone to touch it. On the ground floor, where a sewing machine and a fabric-cutting table had once stood, there was now an upright piano purchased from a school that had closed, its ivory keys yellowed and 3 of them sunken. 7 children came on the first afternoon. By the middle of summer, there were more than a dozen, and anyone was welcome. No one had to pay anything. Toby Ballinger sat in the front row with his trumpet. The boy played louder than necessary, and he was very happy about that. Nell sat in a chair against the wall, her face turned toward the sound of the piano, unable to see anything, only listening, while her hands continued moving steadily over her knitting needles. Draped across the back of the chair beside the piano was a gray-blue wool blanket. It had returned to the very room where it had been knitted. That afternoon, Elias stood at the back of the room near the door, and he didn't step inside. He still came every Wednesday afternoon, still wearing no ring and no watch, and he always stood in that same place. A little girl seated at the piano was practicing a very simple piece, and halfway through, her hand slipped onto the wrong key, sending out a note that sounded completely out of place among all the others. Everyone in the room heard it. The child stopped and looked up at her teacher. Corinne smiled and gave her a gentle nod to continue. No one corrected that note. The story of Corinne Halloway and Elias Barone closes there, in a room filled with the uncertain notes of a piano and a wool blanket draped over the back of a chair. Some acts of kindness are given without expecting anything in return, and those are the very acts that may be repaid with an entire lifetime. The most precious thing we can give another person isn't money, but the willingness to see them as a whole human being, someone with dignity and the right to choose their own path. Every one of us will someday find ourselves lying somewhere in the cold snow of our own lives, and every one of us can also become the person who stops. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone you believe needs to hear it today. Please subscribe to our channel to hear more beautiful and meaningful stories every day. How did Corinne's story make you feel? And if you had been there on that winter night, would you have stopped? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your hearts. We wish everyone listening to this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.